This is the story, or as much of it as we can piece together, of a talented artist born into a remarkable family who seemed to shun attention and hide in the shadows. Behind the scenes at the Towner Gallery in Eastbourne, they store a lot of art which rarely gets seen in public. Once, on a visit to their storeroom, I was shown 7 paintings which intrigued me. They were mainly views of Eastbourne, clearly by a trained and skillful artist, and with a dark and sombre mood. The Towner staff told me little was known about the artist, a woman called Margaret D.M. Benecke. So our story starts here at the Towner Gallery, and it ends back here in Eastbourne at the Ocklinge Cemetery, where Margaret Benecke was buried in 1962. For a talented artist, Margaret seemed to prefer to live in the shadows, but the full name spelled out on her gravestone gives her secret away. Margaret was a granddaughter of the renowned German composer Felix Mendelssohn. Telling Margaret Benecke's story is a mixture of detective work and educated guesswork because she left so few fragments behind her. She was born in 1876 into a remarkable family which had enjoyed celebrity status across Europe for generations. But Margaret was the end of her branch of the family, the youngest of 4 children, 2 of whom died young. By a strange coincidence, another direct descendant of Felix Mendelssohn is living in Eastbourne today. Cecile Steymann is a great-granddaughter of the composer. She has a childhood memory of meeting her cousin.
My father was a grandson of the composer, and his first cousin was Margaret Benecke. And she was the granddaughter of the composer, so that's fairly obvious, I think. And as you know, she never married and had no children. And I was the only child of my parents, you see. She never gave the impression of being terribly worried what she looked like. I remember she had a sort of skirt that went, I think, almost, not quite down to her ankles, but almost down to her ankles. She was wearing some sort of a jacket. She was wearing this cloche hat. She had already grey hair by that time. Not, as far as I remember, not a tiny little dab of makeup or anything like that. The first famous figure in the family was Moses Mendelssohn. That portrait is of him. Moses Mendelssohn was German Jewish philosopher, and he was the grandfather of Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy. Felix Mendelssohn's father was Abraham Mendelssohn. He was a co-founder of the Mendelssohn Bank in Germany. He and his wife had 4 children, one of which was Felix, who was the second child. The first child was Fanny Mendelssohn, and then came Felix, and there were then two more.
In Oxford, the Bodleian Library has one of the world's biggest archives of Mendelssohn family materials, partly because Margaret Benecke's brother Paul was a don at Magdalen College. Peter Ward-Jones, formerly head of music at the Bodleian, showed me some of Felix Mendelssohn's drawings, because the composer was himself quite a talented artist. So this is a lovely family drawing by Felix. Can you say which member of the family is which in this sketch?
Yes, on the sofa you see Felix and his wife Cecile, and then there are the 3 children they had at that time. There were 2 who were born later. Standing up here is Karl, the eldest son, and then here in the middle, sitting down, is Mendelssohn's daughter Marie, who was later to become Marie Benecke, Margaret's mother, and then next to her is Paul, the next son.
It's an exquisite drawing, I think. And
yes, I think the nursemaid appears to be reading to the children.
yes, and I love this little figure of Marie there. It's really, really gorgeous.
Felix Mendelssohn was a child prodigy and went on to have this immensely successful career as composer and pianist, organist and so forth. And in 1837 he married Cécile Jean Renaud. The eldest daughter, Marie, eventually married an Englishman of German descent, Carl Victor Benecke. They had 4 children. Paul Benecke, who became a don here at Magdalen, was the eldest son. Then came Edward, who died in his 20s, and Elsa, who died in her 40s, and then finally Margaret, who was the longest surviving child. None of them married at all, so Felix having had 5 children, and Carl Victor and Marie having had 4 children, unfortunately that was the end of the line.
The household Margaret was born into was in Camberwell, then a fashionable part of South London, with a little community of well-heeled German families. Her mother Marie and her banker husband Carl Victor Bennicker raised their 4 children in a house on this site, where they also enjoyed a glittering social and cultural life. Felix Mendelssohn visited in 1842 and composed this music, the Spring Song, originally known as Camberwell Green, to mark the occasion. Another relative, Franz Mendelssohn, visited in 1883 when Margaret was a child, and wrote home with a vivid description of the elegant house where Marie and Carl Victor assembled musicians, writers, actors and painters.
The dining table was decorated like a rose garden, with roses in little glasses. There was chicken with boiled ham on one side, roast beef on the other, and 3 desserts. A pie, strawberries and cream, which I didn't eat so as not to upset myself.
This is the only picture of young Margaret I've been able to find from the Camberwell years. Somehow she doesn't look too impressed by the stream of celebrities and the social world she grew up with. The earliest art we know of by Margaret is a few copies she did at her mother's request of sketches by her famous grandfather, because Felix Mendelssohn was a skillful artist himself who documented all his travels with beautiful sketches and watercolours.
We have this sequence of drawings here, including the one on the Tummel Bridge, and they were done by Margaret Benecke, and she notes it down in this left-hand corner here, copied by Margaret Benecke, August 1894. And on the opposite side, Tummel Bridge, den 4. August morgens. That was this inscription originally put on it by Mendelssohn himself, but that is in Marie Benecke's hand, the mother's hand.
Right. So these drawings by Margaret show some sort of promise, and I suppose link her very much to her grandfather, who in addition to being a magnificent composer and polymath, was also a brilliant sketcher.
Yes, I mean, Mendelssohn himself, as a boy, received drawing lessons in Berlin, and throughout his life he made sketches of places he visited. Certainly Margaret seems to have picked up the grandfather's habit.
So here we have another copy.
This is of Robert Bruce's Rock at Oban. In the corner you can see that MDMB, Margaret Benecke's initials, and she's dated at the 23rd of September 1893.
From the biography of her brother Paul, we know that at 19, Margaret was away from home studying art, coming home to Camberwell at weekends. But it does not say where she was studying. This was a time when art education for women was usually for accomplishment, not profession. By 1906, after her parents had died, Margaret was living in Eastbourne, where she was to spend most of her life. At that time, Eastbourne was a very fashionable and prosperous resort. But what drew Margaret here? That is probably one of the many unanswered questions about her life.
The only reason that I can think of why Margaret Benecke ever came to Eastbourne in the first place was that she had an uncle called Otto Bennicker, who was living here with his two daughters. Now, possibly when Margaret Benecke's parents died, Otto Bennicker, her uncle, said, why don't you come and have a look at Eastbourne? Perhaps we could find you a nice place to live or something like that. That is the only reason I can think of.
Between 1907 and 1911, Margaret seemed to be making her name as an artist and had several works shown in the exhibitions of the New English Art Club. For many years, from at least 1906, Margaret was advertising her services as an artist at 14 Bath Road in Eastbourne. This house was an annex to the Eastbourne Municipal School of Arts and Crafts, which stood around the corner. Was Margaret on the staff of the art school? We might never know, because the school's records were destroyed when German bombs smashed the building in 1943. Eastbourne's Central Library stands on the site today. In 1911, Margaret was living in a room in an Eastbourne boarding house at number 21 Enis Road. This was the street in which she would spend most of the rest of her life. It must have been during her stay at number 21 that she painted this view of the rooftops of Upperton Gardens from one of the first floor windows. You can see the shape of the bay window below in the foreground. Clearly she was more interested in the almost abstract shapes of the roofs stretching away from her than she was in the feature which dominated the view, a large church which stood immediately opposite her window at that time. This was one of a number of Eastbourne views Margaret painted in a similar style. Perhaps they all date from these years. Several of them, and most of Margaret Benecke's known surviving works, are kept here in the storage room at the Towner Gallery, where I looked at them with the head of collections, Sarah Cooper.
So the painting that we want to look at is just here at the end.
Possibly this is one of the first views she painted of Eastbourne, round about 1911.
Yeah. It's interesting in terms of the views that other artists in the collection have taken of Eastbourne as well. You know, you pointed out this view of the downs that she'd captured, that beautiful sweeping view that comes out at the back of Eastbourne. This was perhaps a particularly grey day. Sometimes you get those mists that roll in over the downs, and she's captured that beautifully.
And there are other surviving Eastbourne views by Margaret Benecke. This one is a lovely one, I think, again undated, but I think it's of Manor Gardens, which was the site of the old Towner Art Gallery.
That's right.
And again you have these lovely views across roofs. She obviously seemed to have a thing about the roofs of Eastbourne. A lovely colour scheme, much brighter than the other one.
Yeah.
And it's possible, I believe, that there may have been a studio at the old Towner Gallery where, again, it's possible that Margaret and her fellow women artists may have met and painted.
After their time, some of the curators lived at Towner, but also used it as their own studio. So I think it's very likely that there was a space there where artists went to work and that she was spending time there. Despite having a studio, you know, in her home nearby, it was probably very attractive for them to be amongst other artists and working directly not only with the paintings but with the views out of the building. So I think that's probably exactly what she was doing here. Her interest in shape and form is starting to come out a bit more, which might have led her later on to the interest in abstraction that we see her go on to. So there's another Eastbourne painting here that perhaps we could have a look at.
This actual view doesn't exist anymore. It could have been painted by Edvard Munch, I would think. The colour scheme is bleak and the trees are obviously just about to lose all their leaves.
But with the same kind of icy grey blue sky that she has in her other roof scenes. It's got a sense of mystery about it, that, you know, we're not sure where she's trying to take our view. What's around the corner? You know, what is this house that stands by itself on the street?
The artist this reminds me of, in particular, strangely, is Edward Hopper.
Oh yes.
Those sort of rather
hyper-real kind of American scenes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is a curious painting. It almost looks like an exercise in painting an interior. Very stiff somehow.
Yeah.
We do know that she trained as an artist, although we're not quite sure where. There were references that she may have studied at the Slade. How do you rate Margaret Benecke as an artist?
Well, I have to say she wasn't someone that I was aware of before I came to Towner. She's obviously very well represented in our collection, being local and sort of playing out her career here with sort of exhibitions in London, as we now know. But I think, you know, within the collection she holds her own. She's very interesting to our audience. Whenever we put them up in collection displays, they're always fascinated.
And of course, at this time, no one would have been aware that she was Mendelssohn's granddaughter.
Exactly.
And the Towner didn't appear to promote her as that.
No.
She was almost, to me, painting incognito.
Absolutely. And perhaps chose to be that way and to not have that connection recognised and to try and make her own career as, you know, as people do now.
3 doors away from the Eastbourne boarding house where Margaret was living in 1911, at number 27 Enos Road, there lived a retired clergyman, the Reverend William Wrighton Andrews, with his daughter Elizabeth, who was close to Margaret in age. Elizabeth Andrews was an artist too. Like Margaret, she had exhibited at the New English Art Club, and a number of her paintings are also at the Towner.
She was the lifelong companion of Margaret Benecke.
They are strikingly different from Margaret Benecke's work. Very, very realistic, but quite delightful. This little girl I adore, her lovely, kind of rather obstinate, very wary expression. Margaret and Elizabeth became lifelong companions. Maybe they met as neighbours here in Enos Road, or maybe it was to be near to Elizabeth that Margaret moved to Enos Road in the first place. It is likely that Elizabeth trained as an artist at the prestigious Slade School in London. It may be, as we don't know where she trained, that Margaret had met her there. Unfortunately, the Slade School no longer has any record of its students from that period. By 1930, Margaret and Elizabeth were sharing an address in Enos Road. Not at number 21 or number 27, but in between them at number 25, now unoccupied and a little overgrown. This was to be their home for the rest of their lives, and it became quite a hive of artistic activity. Apart from Margaret and Elizabeth, the third lady of the household for some 40 years was Innes Ruth Hart, who also dabbled in painting, but made more of a name for herself as the author of a number of published novels. She drew on her familiar surroundings for much of her writing, like this description of ladies sharing a house in a thinly disguised Eastbourne. Beechford, a little old-fashioned in its outlook, as any town must be whose population consists chiefly of schools and of retired professional people, gave the two women an incurious blessing and approval, holding that two sisters who had barely enough to live on anyway did well to economise by living together and sharing the work and expenses of a house. It seemed, moreover, very natural and sensible and right that one of them, the one who had no children to look after, should add to their small joint income by teaching drawing and music, since she had the good fortune to be able to do so. Later she writes about a Dr. Burton hurrying along the uneven red brick pavements. A pleasant street, he noted as he turned into it, but one that had taken the first step down in the world. He felt a growing excitement of suspense and curiosity as the numbers of the houses diminished towards 12. He wondered how it was that Beechford so casually approved and classified the two sisters as an admirable and unpeculiar pair of gentlewomen in reduced circumstances. He noticed suddenly that he had reached number 12, that it was a decent-sized corner house, that the step from the road was broken, and that the dark green garden gate badly needed painting. Looking after the three ladies and their cats was a fourth woman, Daisy Martin, their housekeeper from Cornwall. Throughout their Eastbourne years, the ladies of Enis Road holidayed together in Cornwall, often visiting more than once a year, and apparently spending more time there during the Second World War. Elizabeth Andrews had family connections to Cornwall, and they had a house at Zennor near St Ives, where they lived among other artists. Over the years, Margaret wrote many letters from Cornwall and from Eastbourne to a friend of her brother Paul, confusingly called Margaret Benecke. Paul had been a don at Magdalen College, Oxford, and after his death in 1944, Margaret was the only family member left, and so an important source of information for the biography of Paul, which the other Margaret was writing. The two Margarets struck up a friendship, and many of their letters survive in Oxford at the Bodleian Library. And this very early one in May 1946 gives you an idea, I think, of Margaret when she was in Cornwall with Elizabeth Andrews. It is a wonderful place on the edge of a moor and with an immense view over the Atlantic. Seabirds fly across the windows constantly and foxes walk up to the back door.
Cornwall, December the 1st, 1955. Dear Margaret, you must be home by now. The place is looking much more beautiful now than in summer, with the bracken deep red and the grass gold. The house next door has changed hands and we have painters and sculptors there, which is pleasant. Love to you both from us both. Cornwall, January the 14th, 1956. I don't think I told you that we have new neighbours next door now, the painter and writer Patrick Heron with his family. Actually, they are away just now, but meanwhile a young sculptor is living there. Also, the cottages between us and the sea now house several young painters. Quite an amusing collection altogether. Eastbourne, September 3rd, 1961. This seemed an appropriate moment to send Mrs. Martin away for her long overdue holiday, and we are meanwhile being ministered to by two of E's old admirers, of whom one spends most of her time in impressing her gratitude for being allowed to come here, and the other in trying to reform us. Love to you both, from us both. Yours always, Margaret D.M. Bennicker.
It's very revealing and gives lots of snippets, tantalising snippets of information about Margaret herself, her relationship with Elizabeth Andrews, her companion.
I think one could probably assume that they were partners, and the fact that Margaret Benecke left her possessions to her indicates that too. Interesting that, I mean, Paul, her elder brother, also it seems was gay, so it's a rather curious sort of end to the family line in that sense.
The most surprising of Margaret Benecke's paintings in the Towner Gallery are quite unlike the others. In the 1930s, she experimented with abstract forms. These paintings seem to represent a more disengaged, withdrawn state of mind. Are they formal experiments, or was this a time when Margaret was troubled by the chaos in Europe, her German Jewish origins, and the way her grandfather's reputation was being treated by the Nazis?
Although Mendelssohn himself was brought up as a Christian, in the Nazi eyes, of course, his Jewish ancestry condemned him, and during the Nazi period his works were banned from public performance. And this statue of him, which had been erected in front of the Gewandhaus in Leipzig towards the end of the 19th century, was pulled down at the end of 1936. How the rest of the family reacted to that, we don't really know, but obviously they must have been shocked by that.
These two paintings seem to represent a completely different frame of mind from what she was painting in the 1910s. Very, very different style, a lot of emphasis on form, and probably influenced a lot by other art movements in Europe.
She has completely shifted her work away from the sort of the landscapes, the urban landscapes, I suppose, that we were used to seeing before of the 1910s, 1911, to this complete abstraction and paring down of all the forms. And I suspect that did come from the Europe-wide influence of abstraction.
This painting, which is called Glacier Forms, seems to me to represent almost a glacial temperament. It's frozen, it's very cold, the blues and the greys and so on, very stark and stripped of all emotion and spontaneity.
It perhaps demonstrates that we as viewers are often or can be quite influenced by titles of works, which I suspect is why some artists don't title their works. In this case, Glacier Forms is giving us something to project onto what we think the artist could be, what her personality could be, what her interests are. You know, perhaps she was cold and uncommunicative. We don't know that, but this image could, and the title certainly suggests that that could be the case.
So was Margaret Benecke a cold and uncommunicative person? A rare glimpse of her is provided by the writer and musicologist Roger Fisk, who wrote this book about composers who had been inspired by Scotland, including Mendelssohn. In it, he mentions visiting a friend in Eastbourne in 1949.
She shared the house with two other elderly spinsters, and all three spent their days energetically painting and sculpting to very good purpose. The first evening at supper, I remarked by way of making conversation that the portrait over the fireplace looked remarkably like Mendelssohn. "It is Mendelssohn," said the thin, Eton-cropped old lady on my right, and she added gruffly and astonishingly, "my grandfather." Also on the walls were some of her own intellectual abstract oils, their green and grey geometrical shapes as reserved as their creator. Mendelssohn would have found them puzzling. It seemed hardly credible that a man who had died more than a century ago should
She'd have a granddaughter, alive and active, and in Eastbourne of all places, but it was true.
The description of her second cousin rings true for Cecile Stehman.
Yeah, very much so. It's a very good description, yes. She was rather a stern-looking lady, very reserved. I don't remember her smiling, I would say, at all, or, you know, a lot, not at all. And I remember her looking at me rather sort of, you know, what's that child doing there kind of thing, this kind of look, you know. But I believe that was fairly characteristic of her. Lots of people said that she seemed to be rather distant in any case.
Someone else with his own memories of Margaret Benecke is one of the most prominent Sussex artists of the current generation, Harold Mockford. By the 1960s, Margaret and Elizabeth could no longer manage the stairs to their studio in the attic. Instead, they painted in a garage at the bottom of the garden and let younger artists work upstairs. They gave the young Harold Mockford studio space, endless quantities of paint and daily lunches. Today, he still has some of Margaret Benecke's paintings, including this geometrical composition with cats, and this one of trees.
She was very private and she said very little. She would come scuttling downstairs at lunchtime, and there's 3 flights of stairs, and she'd come scuttling down and she would sit down at the table, and that was it, really. She didn't say anything. She was related to Mendelssohn, and but in a way there was never any music. It was strange, really, when I think about it. Music didn't play much of a part in, well, I don't think it played any part in the house. She sat opposite Miss Andrews, and then there was Miss Hart. They were all interesting ladies. I think in the days when, in a way, women were, oh, I don't know, they had an image of what a woman was, and I don't think these three ladies fitted the image really. Presiding over it all was Mrs. Martin, a little Cornish lady who had an ideal boiler in the house, which was never closed, but always just roaring away, and the room was full of smoke. Always had a fag on at the corner of her mouth, you know, even when cooking.
One of Margaret Benecke's paintings, the one which made the biggest impression on me, clearly seems to show the interior of the attic studio at 25 Enos Road. The mood is extraordinarily dark and oppressive. A woman is kneeling with a bucket. A heavy horizontal girder dominates the composition, appearing to weigh down on the woman whose face is obscured. The small window behind her throws very little light into the room. This depressing scene is apparently a very popular item in the Towner Gallery collection.
Oh yes, now this is the painting which first impressed me the most. It's so dark and oppressive, goodness knows what was going through her mind when she painted it. And yet you have told me that this is one of the most popular paintings in the Towner Gallery and very popular with children.
It is indeed, and it is one that has featured in our annual schools exhibition, as well as being one that we lend out frequently to schools as part of our schools loan scheme. It's fascinating to them, it's intriguing, and I think it is about exactly the things that you talked about, the gloominess, the mystery. They can make up stories about the figure, the empty room. There's, I think, a lot of ghost stories have come out of it. You know, it leads them to be very creative and imaginative themselves from this sort of inspiring starting point.
It's very gothic, isn't it? It's real Mad Woman in the Attic stuff.
Absolutely, and I think perhaps sometimes we underestimate people that they will find it creepy or tricky, but I think that's exactly part of its interest, is that gothic kind of darkness inherent in it.
And the faceless woman.
The faceless woman bending down at work and as you say, being kind of oppressed by the space.
Why was Margaret Benecke such a private and reclusive person? Could one reason be that she felt burdened by her family heritage and that her art would never be good enough to live up to the Mendelssohn name?
She was a very retiring lady, and she wouldn't want it to be known that she was related to the Mendelssohns.
I think this was almost a family thing. It was taken more or less for granted, I think, that if you had the name Mendelssohn, then you were a member of the family. Whatever you had to do, you had to be top-notch. With my name, if I was sort of, you know, in the second chorus of some musical or something like that, that just wouldn't go, you see. And of course, I mean, music was almost out because of the name.
Margaret Benecke died at the age of 86 in 1962. Her modest grave in Eastbourne's Ocklinge Cemetery was purchased by her lifelong companion, Elizabeth Andrews, to whom she left all her possessions. All that remains of her are the 7 paintings in Eastbourne's Towner Gallery, 2 more in Harold Mockford's possession, and 1 or 2 others in private ownership, which occasionally change hands in auctions. Why is there no more to show for the 60 or 70 years she spent as an artist? It fell to Daisy Martin, the Cornish housekeeper, to clear the house in Enos Road when Elizabeth Andrews died 15 years after Margaret. We will never know how Mrs. Martin went about this task and what might have been given away or ended up in the skip.
If Margaret Benecke were alive today, I doubt if she would have cooperated with this telling of her story. She gave the world her art, or some of it, but preferred to stay in the shadows herself. As a young woman, she was keen to leave her mark on the world as an artist, but maybe as the years went past, painting became more of a private passion.
50 years on from her death, we are living in very different times. Now women can be professional artists and have their achievements celebrated and remunerated. Now we can have foreign ancestry, unconventional relationships, eccentric lifestyles, and not be so anxious about attracting the wrong sort of attention. Maybe if she'd been alive today, Margaret might have flowered as an artist, got the recognition she deserved, maybe had a huge following on Facebook, and enjoyed the public attention.